What if some of the biggest Catholic stories in the world are happening in places most people stopped watching? What if, while many keep saying the church is fading, quiet lines are forming for baptism, old churches are filling again, and young people are searching for something solid, holy, and true? Stay with me until the very end, because the last nation on this list may completely change the way you see the future of the Catholic Church. This is not just a list of places. It is a sign that faith can grow again, even where many thought it was almost gone. When people hear the word boom, they often think of huge crowds, loud headlines, and dramatic public moments. But that is not always how the Catholic Church grows. Sometimes it happens in a slower and deeper way. A few more people come to Massachusetts. Then a few more ask questions. Then more adults ask for baptism. Then families begin returning. Then young people, who were supposed to have no interest in faith at all, start kneeling, praying, and searching for meaning again. Quiet growth can become strong growth. And strong growth, if it lasts, can shape a whole nation. That is why this list matters. These are not just 5 nations with interesting numbers. These are 5 places where Catholic life is showing signs of real strength. In some of them, the surprise is that adults are entering the church in higher numbers. In others, the surprise is that baptisms are rising after years of weakness. In others, the church is growing not by noise, but by steady faith, local witness, and people who are hungry for something more than comfort and speed. What makes all of these stories powerful is this simple fact. People are still looking for God. And maybe that is the deepest reason these stories matter so much right now. We live in a time when many people feel tired, restless, and spiritually empty. They have more screens, more noise, and more opinions than ever before, but many still feel lost. So when even one nation begins to show signs of Catholic renewal, it catches attention. But when 5 nations begin showing those signs, something bigger may be happening. Maybe the church is not only surviving. Maybe in quiet corners of the world, it is rising again. And number 5 is the Netherlands, a country many people think of as modern, rich, and deeply less religious. For years, the story told about the Netherlands was simple. Old faith was fading, church life was shrinking, and religion was becoming less important to everyday life. On the surface, that story seemed easy to believe. But then something unexpected began to appear in the numbers. In 2024, the number of adults joining the Catholic Church in the Netherlands rose by almost 40% compared with the year before. More than 500 adults were baptized as Catholics, and more than 100 other adults were received into the church after already being baptized in another Christian tradition. In a nation where many assumed Catholic growth belonged only to the past, that kind of rise is not small. It is a real sign of movement. Now, to understand why this matters, you have to look beyond the raw numbers and feel the deeper meaning. The Netherlands is not a place where people expect faith to return in strong ways. It is a place often used as an example of what happens when old Christian identity weakens. That is exactly why this new rise is so important. When adults choose baptism in a place like this, they are not simply following family custom. They're making a choice. They're saying yes after living in a culture where saying no would be much easier. That gives this growth a special weight. It means these are not only inherited Catholics. Many of them are chosen Catholics. There is something beautiful about that. A person can grow up around churches and never notice them. A nation can carry Christian history in its buildings and still forget the faith that built them. But then one person starts asking questions. Another walks into a parish. Another lights a candle. Another begins to pray after years of silence. Little by little, a country that looked spiritually tired begins to show signs of life. That is how quiet renewal often begins. Not with power, not with force, with hunger. The Dutch story also reminds us that the church does not only grow through childhood baptism. It also grows through adult conversion, adult return, and adult conviction. There is something strong about a grown person deciding that Christ is worth following, that the Mass is worth learning, and that the church is worth joining even when the culture around them has moved in other directions. In that sense, the Dutch rise is not just about numbers. It is about seriousness. It is about people finding faith not because it is easy, but because they believe it is true. And maybe that is why the Netherlands belongs on this list. This is not yet the loudest Catholic story in the world. It is not the biggest by total size, but it is one of the clearest signs that even in deeply modern places, the heart still searches for God. A near 40% rise in adults joining the church is not an accident. It is a quiet signal that the Catholic Church still has the power to call people home. And number 4 is Belgium, another nation many had almost stopped expecting strong Catholic news from. Like the Netherlands, Belgium has often been seen as a place where Christian life had weakened over time. Many people assumed the trend was set, that the old churches would keep getting emptier, and that Catholic belief would survive only in memory, art, and history books. But the recent movement in Belgium tells a different story. The number of adults preparing for baptism rose to 534 in 2025 and then climbed again to 689 in 2026. That is nearly a 30% jump in 1 year and a huge rise from just 229 in 2016. Think about what that means. In only 10 years, adult baptisms in Belgium moved from a small stream to something much more noticeable. And again, these are not children being brought to church because that is what families have always done. These are adults saying yes. Adults who had time to doubt, time to delay, time to stay away, and yet still turned toward the church. In a country where many thought Catholic life was mostly a memory of the past, that kind of rise speaks with real force. It says that something is moving under the surface. Belgium's story is powerful because it breaks a very common idea. Many assume that once a nation becomes less religious, the old faith cannot really return. Maybe churches stay open, maybe traditions remain, but real growth, they think, is over. Belgium pushes back against that idea. It suggests that faith can return in the very places where people once assumed it had no future. The soil may look dry for years, but when grace begins to work, life can rise again in ways few expected. There's also a human side to this that numbers alone cannot show. Every adult baptism is a story. Behind each one is a person who asked questions, fought inner battles, looked for meaning, and finally chose the church. Some may have come from no faith at all. Some may have been raised around religion but never lived it. Some may have found the church through beauty, prayer, history, suffering, or love. The numbers matter, yes. But what makes them so moving is that each number is a soul. Each one is a life turning toward Christ. And that is why Belgium feels so important right now. It is not because Belgium suddenly became the most Catholic nation in Europe. It is because even there, in a place many expected little from, the church is not standing still. Adult baptisms do not keep rising year after year for no reason. Something is drawing people in. Something is waking up. Something quiet, but very real, is happening. And number 3 is South Korea, and this nation belongs on the list for a different reason. South Korea's Catholic story is not simply about surprising adult entries in a secular old European setting. It is about steady life, visible growth, and a church that has shown real strength even after the hard years of the pandemic. According to the South Korean bishop's report, the number of Catholics in the country reached 5,970,675 by the end of 2023. That was a small increase overall, but the more striking sign came in baptisms. In 2023, the number of new baptisms rose to 51,307, which was 24% higher than the year before. Sunday Mass attendance also moved upward, showing that Catholic life was not only surviving, but recovering. Why is this so important? Because South Korea shows that Catholic growth does not have to look dramatic to be powerful. Sometimes the strongest story is not an explosion. It is a steady return. It is baptisms rising, mass attendance rising, and a church regaining strength after a hard season. And what makes Korea even more interesting is that a large share of those baptisms are adults. According to the same report, adults made up more than 2/3 of new baptisms. That tells us something very clear. The The church in Korea is not only holding on to people from childhood, it is still attracting new believers in adult life. South Korea also carries a special Catholic beauty because of how the faith grew there in the first place. Unlike many places where missionaries came first, the Korean church has long been remembered for the strong role of local believers in spreading the faith. That history still matters. It reminds us that the church grows best when faith becomes personal, local, and lived. And when you look at the signs of recovery today, you can feel that same strength again. The numbers are important, but the deeper point is this. The Catholic Church in Korea still has life, still has movement, and still has the power to call people into belief. Another reason Korea stands out is that it shows Catholicism can remain deeply meaningful in an advanced, fast-moving, highly modern society. Many people assume that when a country becomes more wealthy, more digital, and more competitive, serious faith will always weaken. South Korea pushes against that idea. It shows that modern life does not erase the human need for truth, worship, and hope. Even in a world of speed and pressure, people still want meaning. They still want a place to kneel. They still want something stronger than success. And that is why South Korea deserves a place near the top of this list. Its Catholic growth may not always make giant headlines in the West, but the signs are there. New baptisms are up. Mass life is recovering. Adult entries remain strong. In a region where the church's future matters greatly, Korea is showing that quiet Catholic strength can endure, recover, and keep growing. It is not a passing story. It is a living one. And number 2 is England, a nation whose Catholic story has become one of the most talked about signs of renewal in recent years. For a long time, the common idea was that England had moved too far from Christian roots for any serious Catholic return to happen on a large scale. Churches might remain as beautiful buildings. Catholic schools might still matter. But the idea of many adults entering the church again seemed, to many people, unlikely. Yet in 2025, the numbers coming from different dioceses told a very different story. In Westminster alone, more than 500 adults were set to be received into the Catholic Church at Easter, the highest number there since 2018. In Southwark, more than 450 adults were moving through the process of entering the church. And it was not only London. Across England and Wales, many dioceses reported strong growth. Birmingham had 201 people at the rite of election in 2025, up from nearly 130 the year before. Liverpool was preparing to receive 140 people, up from 110 in 2024. Arundel and Brighton rose from around 150 people in 2024 to about 210 in 2025. Cardiff reported 75 people, which was a 100% increase from the year before. In other words, this was not just one strong parish or one unusual city. The movement was spread across many places. That spread matters a lot. When growth appears in one church, it may be a local story. When it appears across many dioceses, it begins to look like a wider turn. And in England, many observers have noticed something else that makes the story even more striking: a visible rise in younger adults, especially young men. Some were first drawn in by Catholic voices online. Some began with history or philosophy. Some were searching for truth in a culture that felt empty. Some were moved by the beauty and seriousness of the faith. But whatever road brought them to the church, the end of the road was often the same. They wanted baptism. They wanted Massachusetts. They wanted the Catholic faith in full. There is something deeply moving about that, because England has such a long and painful Catholic history. This is a land where the faith was once pushed to the edge, where Catholic life survived hard years, and where old wounds still live in memory. So when adults begin entering the church in larger numbers again, the story carries more than simple growth. It carries healing. It carries return. It carries the sense that a faith once pushed into corners is standing more openly again. England's Catholic rise also shows the power of witness in the modern age. A person can hear one strong voice online, then read one book, then visit one church, then speak to one priest, then begin a journey that changes everything. We live in a time when the internet can spread confusion very quickly. But England's story shows that it can also lead people toward truth. Not because a screen can replace the church, but because it can become the first door that opens toward it. And what are people looking for when they walk through that door? Very often, they're looking for what modern life cannot easily give them. They want stability in a world of chaos. They want beauty in a world of cheap distraction. They want truth in a culture that tells them truth does not exist. They want a faith that asks something of them, not one that simply reflects back whatever they already think. That is one reason the Catholic Church can feel so powerful to many new believers. It does not promise ease. It offers meaning. So when we say England is quietly booming, we do not mean that every church is full or every problem is solved. We mean that the old story of endless decline no longer explains what is happening. New adults are entering. Young people are asking questions. Dioceses are reporting strong rises. The Catholic Church in England is not simply holding on. In many places, it is growing with calm but real force. And that is why England stands at number 2. And number 1 is France. And if there's one nation on this list that most clearly shows a quiet Catholic boom turning into something impossible to ignore, it is France. For years, France has often been described as a place where the church was losing ground, where old cathedrals remained but belief was thinning out, and where Christian identity seemed to belong more to history than to the future. But the most recent baptism numbers tell a story that is far more hopeful. In 2025, France was set to welcome more than 10,384 adults in a baptism at Easter. That was a 45% jump from a year before, and the highest number ever recorded since the French bishops began tracking this data more than 20 years ago. And that was not the only surprise. More than 7,400 teenagers between the ages of 11 and 17 were also preparing for baptism, a rise of 33% from the year before. Even more striking, the largest group among the adults was the 18 to 25 age group. Young adults, many of them students and young workers, made up 42% of adult baptism candidates. That means the strongest movement in France was not simply coming from the old or from those raised in older Catholic homes. It was being carried in large part by the young. Stop and think about that for a moment. In one of the great old lands of European Christianity, at a time when many people had almost given up on the idea of youth returning to the church, young adults became the leading face of new Catholic baptism. That is not a small detail. That changes the whole feeling of the story. It says this is not only a last echo of an older France. It may be the beginning of a new one. When young people move toward the church in large numbers, they bring not only life for today, but possibility for tomorrow. France's rise becomes even more powerful when you look at the longer line of the story. In 2015, the number of adult baptisms in France was around 3,900. By 2025, it had climbed to more than 10,384. That is a rise of about 160% over 10 years. That kind of growth does not happen by chance. It points to something deeper than a one-season trend. It suggests that under the surface of a country many thought had turned away for good, there's been a slow and steady hunger for God building over time. There were other signs too. Reports from France described packed churches on Ash Wednesday, standing room crowds, and many young faces showing up, some for the first time. Priests spoke openly about broken attendance records. In one church in Lille, nearly 1,000 faithful gathered in the evening, and many of them were young people. So the baptism rise was not an isolated fact. It was part of a wider picture. The church in France was not only counting more candidates on paper. It was seeing more bodies in queues, more life in parishes, and more interest among people many thought were lost to faith. Why is France so important in this story? Because France has long held a special place in Catholic memory. It is a country of saints, shrines, cathedrals, thinkers, and missionaries. For many believers, watching France drift away from strong Catholic life felt painful, almost symbolic. So when signs of return appear there, they carry a meaning beyond one nation. They feel like a message. They feel like a reminder that decline is not the only possible future. They say that even old Christian lands can still hear the gospel again. France also reminds us of something very simple but very easy to forget. The church often grows most powerfully when people are no longer joining only because of social habit. In places where faith is not automatic, belief can become more personal and more direct. A young adult in France asking for baptism is usually not doing it because it is fashionable. He or she is doing it because something real has happened in the heart. Maybe through suffering, maybe through beauty, maybe through friendship, maybe through prayer. But somehow, through all the noise of modern life, the voice of God has still been heard. And that may be the deepest reason France stands at number one. The rise there is not only large, it is symbolic. It tells the world that the Catholic Church can still surprise us in places where many had already written the final chapter. It tells us that even after years of weak headlines, spiritual hunger can gather force quietly, patiently, and then all at once become too large to ignore. France is not just seeing a few war moments. It is seeing one of the clearest Catholic renewal stories in the world right now. Now step back and look at the whole picture. The Netherlands shows adults turning toward the church in surprising numbers. Belgium shows a strong rise in adult baptisms year after year. South Korea shows steady Catholic life, rising baptisms, and recovery after hard years. England shows young people and adults entering the church across many dioceses. France shows record baptisms, youth movement, and a return that few expected to happen so strongly. These are not all the same kind of story, but together they point in one direction. The Catholic Church is still growing in places where many thought growth was unlikely. That does not mean every problem is gone. It does not mean every parish is full. It does not mean every nation on this list has suddenly become deeply Catholic again. But it does mean that the old story of simple decline is no longer enough. Something else is happening. In some places, people are entering the church for the first time. In some, they're coming back. In some, they're discovering the Mass after years of distance. In some, the young are leading the movement. In others, the strength comes through patient local faith. But taken together, these signs matter. And maybe what they show most clearly is this: people are still hungry for God. Beneath all the noise, all the politics, all the speed, all the modern promises that leave the soul empty, there is still a deep human need for truth, mercy, worship, beauty, forgiveness, and hope. The Catholic Church speaks to that hunger in a way that reaches across nations, languages, and cultures. That is why these stories keep appearing. Not because the world has become easy, but because the human heart still longs for more than the world can give. So the next time someone tells you the Catholic Church has no future, remember these 5 nations. Remember the adults asking for baptism in the Netherlands. Remember the rise in Belgium. Remember the strong signs of life in South Korea. Remember the adults entering the church across England. And remember the thousands of young people and adults preparing for baptism in France. The church may grow quietly, but quiet does not mean weak. Sometimes quiet growth is the deepest growth of all. And if these signs continue, then the real question is no longer whether the Catholic Church can still grow. The real question is where the next quiet boom will happen. Will it come in another old European nation? Will it rise in a city no one is watching? Will it come through young adults, families, or people who had no faith at all? No one knows for sure. But one thing is certain: the story is not over. In many places, it may just be beginning. If this list surprised you, take a moment and think about which nation moved you the most. Was it the steady return in England, the young baptisms in France, the rise in Belgium, the strength of South Korea, or the surprise of the Netherlands? And more importantly, what do these stories say to your own heart? Maybe they're not only about other countries. Maybe they're a reminder that faith can rise again anywhere, even in places that look tired, even in lives that feel far away, even in hearts that thought they were done searching. Stay close to that thought, because the history of the church has always been full of places where grace began quietly. A small group, a hidden prayer, a late return, one baptism, one confession, one person kneeling after years away. And then, little by little, a whole story changes. That is how revival often begins. Not with noise, but with yes. Not with power, but with surrender. Not with perfect people, but with people who are ready to let God move. So as this journey ends, let leave you with hope. The Catholic Church is not only a memory of the past. In these nations and in many others, it is still alive, still calling, still growing, and still reaching people who thought they were beyond its doors. Quietly, patiently, and with more strength than many realize, the Church is rising again.